Terry Kolath. I'm here today with Professor Adrian Kerr, and we are going to start a two-part session, Ancient Persia and Alexander. And we're talking about session one, how the young Macedonian king conquered the known world. Thank you for joining me, Adrian.
It's a pleasure, Terry. Good to be at Shell Point again.
Well, this is a pretty interesting beginning to the history of Persia and Alexander.
Yes, we're going to start off some time before Alexander came onto the scene, just to set the scene.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to talk about the two great cultural enemies in that part of the world. You had the Persian Empire, which was the largest empire the world had seen at that time in terms of contiguous spread, all the way over from the Indus Valley, which is now Pakistan, all the way over to the Mediterranean. Remember, Winston Churchill used to use the expression, history is written by the victors. So most of what we know about this period was written by either the Greeks or the Macedonians. And unfortunately, we don't have too much independent check against that from the point of view of ancient Persia. But of course, they get a lot of bad press. Mm-hmm. You know, so the Greeks, who are Athenians, are democratic, for instance. They hate the idea that the Persians had an absolute king and had slaves and such. So you get a lot of bad press about they was uncivilized or barbaric, whereas the Greeks were perfect. So the balance, of course, is somewhere in the middle. And in fact, looking back on history, the empire that the Persians had created was really significant and very sophisticated educationally, organized. It had interstates, they had a Pony Express system, they had a letter delivery system.
Amazing.
They built wonderful capital cities, they had a marvelous army and navy, and so the Persians should be considered as a very strong power. And they were moving ever westwards, and they took over Asia Minor, and then they came into conflict with the Greeks. And the Greeks, of course, were never a unified empire like Persia was. They were a bunch of city-states who kept on falling out with each other, but when there was a common enemy, as in Persia, of course, they went to war. And the two famous battles which are ingrained in everybody's memory is the First Battle of Marathon, where Athens was able to fend off the invading Persians, but then when Xerxes came along to avenge that defeat, the Spartans put up a lone attempt to fend them off at the Pass of Thermopylae, which is, everybody knows about that, but the Xerxes army was so great and his navy was so great that Athens was burnt to the ground. And in fact, in doing so, they burnt all the wooden temples, of which the Parthenon was mostly wood at that time. When it came to rebuild Athens, they built it in marble, and that's why we have such wonderful temples in the Greek world. But the conflict between Greece and Persia petered out over a period of about 150 years. It wasn't they won, which side had absolute victory. It was just they eventually got worn out, and they agreed a peace, and so the Greek cities remained independent, and the Persian Empire continued. Then you'd think that was a time of great opportunity. Indeed it was. Around 450 BC, Athens became the wealthiest city in the world on a GDP per person basis. They built beautiful monuments like the Acropolis and the Parthenon, the Erechtheion and so on. And they went traveling. The very first history book was written by Herodotus, who went to Egypt and he went to the Middle East, and he wrote his travels up, and you can buy it today in Amazon, Barnes & Noble, exactly as he saw it. Half of it is fiction, but it's a good read. So these wealthy Athenians were traveling all around the place, and that should have been the beginning of a pan-Greek democratic structure. Well, it wasn't to be. And these individual cities all wanted to outdo each other. They had different gods. They had, on one hand, Athens had democracy, sort of, whereas Sparta had a slave state. So they were never going to see eye to eye. And after the common enemy was gone, Persia, then they started beating each other up. And so we start to see for 100 years these inter-city wars. And at the end of that period, Greece is on its knees. All of the city-states are worn out, broke. They've been fighting each other for so long. And nature abhors a vacuum. And this vacuum that the city-states had created was an open door to the folk in the north of Greece called Macedonians, and their capital city Pella. And of course, we see that Philip, the king of the Macedonians, saw a great opportunity to march south with his army and capture each of those Greek cities one by one. And so it was that Philip II became the master of Macedonia and the Greek cities. Of course, the Greeks were mumbling and grumbling and didn't like it, but they couldn't do anything about it because he was too strong. It also was the demise of democracy. The Athenian experiment with democracy for 170 years was washed away because the last thing that any supreme leader wants is any element of democracy from a conquered city. So that's the end of democracy for a while. He was assassinated, Philip, and we'll talk about the various candidates. And his son, young son, who had been fighting with him in the cavalry, then became the undisputed leader of Macedonia and Greece. And it's quite curious that if you speak to somebody from Greece today, they will adopt Alexander and say, oh, he was Greek. But at the time, he was a barbarian because the Macedonians spoke very different Greek to the mainland city-states. And so the Greeks considered the Macedonians and Philip and Alexander to be barbarians. And so it's quite funny today that, oh, no, you're part of our culture. So Alexander then suppresses the revolt that happens in the city-states of Greece. They thought it was an opportunity to get rid of the Macedonians, but no, it wasn't. They were going to fight Alexander. And then he has a great belief in his destiny. And the magic of the Alexander story is his wife, his mother was a snake worshipper, and she constantly told this young Alexander growing up that his father was not Philip, it was Zeus. She had slept with Zeus, and Alexander was the son of Zeus, and it was his destiny to take over the world. And he set about a pursuit of, is that true, Mom? And how can I demonstrate that? And if it is true, I better implement that dream. And that's the second part.
Well, stay tuned for part 2.